The communications array on Nexus Station crackled to life with desperate urgency. Ambassador Zethkree's crystalline form vibrated with alarm as the distress signal pierced through the usual diplomatic chatter of the Galactic Council chambers. Her translucent blue skin shifted to deep purple, indicating extreme distress among her kind. "Emergency broadcast from the Kepler 442 system," she announced to the assembled representatives. "The mining colony on Kepler 442b is under siege. Unknown hostile forces have overwhelmed their defenses." The chamber fell silent. Kepler 442b was known throughout the galaxy as one of the most inhospitable worlds ever colonized. The Veltar had established their mining operation there precisely because no other species could survive the crushing gravity, toxic atmosphere, and extreme temperature fluctuations. If something had overwhelmed the hardy Veltar, it posed a threat unlike anything the galaxy had encountered. Representative Gexelon of the Maritime Federation clicked his mandibles nervously. What manner of force could threaten the Veltar on such a world? They are among the most resilient species in the Council. "The transmission is fragmentary," Zethkree replied, her form flickering as she accessed the data streams. References to shadow swarms and void-touched entities. The last coherent message spoke of creatures that seemed to feed on the planet's harsh conditions, growing stronger in environments that would kill most of us. A ripple of fear passed through the chamber. The assembled species represented the best the galaxy had to offer. The technologically advanced Kithra, the psychically gifted Mindari, the industrious Veltar, and dozens of other civilizations. Yet each had evolved on worlds that, while diverse, shared certain basic requirements for life. They had conquered space through ingenuity and cooperation, but they remained fundamentally limited by their biological origins. "We must respond," declared Commander Vex Hari of the Kithra Defense Corps. "The Veltar colony houses nearly 50,000 souls. We cannot abandon them." "With what?" Gexelon's question hung heavy in the air. "Our finest warships are designed for combat in space or on habitable worlds. Kepler 442b would destroy our crews before they could even deploy." The truth was uncomfortable but undeniable. The planet's surface pressure was 12 times that of most homeworlds. The atmosphere was a cocktail of methane, ammonia, and sulfur compounds that would corrode their equipment and poison their crews within minutes. Surface temperatures swung from -200 to +300 degrees Celsius. Even the Veltar required extensive environmental suits and underground habitation to survive there. "Perhaps we could provide orbital support," suggested Mindari collective speaker Thalin, her mental voice touching each representative's consciousness. "Long-range bombardment to clear the hostile forces." "Unacceptable." Zethkree's form flashed angry red. "Such action would likely kill the colonists we're trying to save. We need ground forces capable of operating in those conditions while distinguishing between friend and foe." The chamber erupted in frustrated discussion. Plan after plan was proposed and discarded. Environmental suits weren't enough. Robotic forces would be too slow and clumsy in the crushing gravity. Even their most advanced terraforming technology would take years to make the planet approachable for rescue operations. As the debate raged, a quiet voice spoke from the back of the chamber. "What about the deathworlders?" The suggestion came from junior diplomat Kexara, a young Zephyrian whose species had only recently joined the council. The chamber fell silent, all eyes turning to her delicate butterfly-like form. "The what?" Commander Vex Hari's mechanical translator struggled with the unfamiliar term. "The humans," Kexara clarified, her iridescent wings trembling slightly. "They call their homeworld Earth, but our surveys classified it as a Class 12 death world. Crushing gravity, toxic atmosphere composition, extreme weather, dangerous radiation levels, and predatory ecosystem. By all rights, it should be uninhabitable." "Impossible," scoffed Gexelon. "No sapient species could evolve under such conditions." "Yet they did," Kexara insisted. "Our first contact teams barely survived the encounter with their environment. The humans not only live there comfortably, they've thrived. They've colonized dozens of worlds we consider uninhabitable. They actually seem to prefer hostile environments." Zethkree's form shifted to curious yellow. "I remember the reports. Their physiology is unlike anything we've encountered. Dense bone structure, redundant organ systems, remarkable healing capabilities. Their military forces train in conditions that would kill most species. They're not council members," Commander Vex Hari pointed out. "They've maintained strict neutrality since first contact. Limited trade agreements only. Because we treat them as curiosities rather than equals, Kexara said boldly. They know we find their world horrifying and their adaptations disturbing. They've kept their distance because they believe we fear them. Another uncomfortable silence fell. It was true that many species found humans unsettling. Their ability to survive in hostile environments, their remarkable resilience to injury, their capacity for violence when threatened, all marked them as fundamentally different from the civilized galaxy. They were living reminders that the universe could produce intelligent life under the most terrible conditions. Even if they agreed to help, Kexalon said slowly, how could we ask them to risk their lives for strangers? They have no obligation to the Veltar colony. Because that's what they do, Kexara replied with surprising certainty. I've studied their history. They have something they call search and rescue. When others are in danger, they respond regardless of personal cost. It's built into their nature. Ambassador HFY processed this information, her form cycling through various colors as she accessed historical databases. The human files were surprisingly detailed despite limited contact. Wars fought not for conquest but to protect others. Disasters where humans risked everything to save strangers. Even their entertainment was filled with stories of individuals sacrificing themselves for the greater good. The vote must be unanimous, she announced finally. We're asking an independent species to risk their lives in our service. If we do this, we're acknowledging that we need them, that their deathworlder nature makes them uniquely suited to challenges we cannot face. The implications were staggering. The Galactic Council had always maintained that civilization meant overcoming one's environment through technology and cooperation. Humans represented a different path, adaptation through biological resilience and psychological fortitude. Admitting they were needed would challenge fundamental assumptions about what it meant to be an advanced species. One by one, the representatives cast their votes. Fear for the Veltar colonists ultimately overcame pride and prejudice. The vote was unanimous. Then it's decided, HFY announced. We humble ourselves before the deathworlders and ask for their aid. The transmission to Earth would take 6 hours. The response would determine the fate of 50,000 souls and potentially reshape the galaxy's understanding of strength, civilization, and the meaning of sentient life itself. Captain Sarah Chen stood at the observation deck of the UES Indomitable, watching Earth's blue marble rotate slowly beneath them. The transmission from the Galactic Council had arrived 3 hours ago, and the response was already being prepared. Around her, the ship buzzed with activity as crew members made final preparations for what might be humanity's first major intervention in galactic affairs. Captain, incoming priority message from Fleet Admiral Rodriguez, her communications officer announced. Sarah nodded and accepted the connection. The Admiral's weathered face appeared on her personal display, lines of concern etched deep around his eyes. Sarah, I won't lie to you. This mission is unlike anything we've attempted. The galactic species think of us as useful monsters, barely civilized enough for limited contact. Now they're asking us to risk our lives for strangers on a world that makes Earth look like a vacation resort. Understood, sir. What's our mission profile? Extraction and rescue. Intelligence suggests an unknown hostile force has overrun the mining colony on Kepler 442b. 50,000 Veltar civilians trapped underground, maybe less by now. The planet's conditions make it impossible for other Council species to mount an effective rescue. Sarah pulled up the planetary data on her secondary screen. The numbers were sobering even by human standards. Sir, this is beyond extreme environment operations. We're talking about surface pressure that could crush our standard gear, atmospheric composition that'll eat through equipment, and temperature swings that would challenge our best environmental suits. Which is exactly why they called us instead of trying it themselves. Rodriguez replied grimly. The Veltar are tough, but they're not deathworlders. They survive harsh environments through technology, not biological adaptation. When that technology fails, they're vulnerable. Sarah understood the implication. Humans had earned their deathworlder reputation through millennia of surviving impossible conditions. Ice ages, volcanic winters, plagues, natural disasters. Humanity had endured them all and emerged stronger. What seemed impossible to other species was just another Tuesday for human military forces. What do we know about the hostile force? Precious little. The Veltar called them shadow swarms and void-touched entities. Based on the fragments we've received, They appear to be some kind of energy-based life form that feeds on harsh environmental conditions. The worse the environment, the stronger they become. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Sir, if that's accurate, then Kepler 442b isn't just a hostile environment we have to survive. It's actively strengthening our enemies. That's our assessment as well. Which is why I'm sending you specifically. Sarah, your record in extreme environment operations is unmatched, and your crew has more deathworlder experience than any other unit in the fleet. The captain looked around at her bridge crew with new understanding. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, her tactical officer, had grown up on Titan where the surface temperature was minus 180 Celsius. Chief Engineer Rosa Martinez had spent 5 years maintaining equipment on Venus, where the atmospheric pressure and sulfuric acid rain would kill most humans in seconds. Communications Officer David Park had served on stations orbiting neutron stars, dealing with radiation levels that would sterilize entire cities. These weren't just skilled professionals. They were humans who had chosen to live and work in conditions that other species used as examples of uninhabitable hell worlds. They were deathworlders by choice as well as birth. How long do we have? The Veltar colony has enough power and supplies to maintain their underground shelters for maybe 72 hours. After that, life support fails and they start dying regardless of the surface threat. Transit time to Kepler 442 is 48 hours at maximum burn. That gives us 24 hours on site, assuming we arrive with the colony still intact. The Council is providing everything they can: detailed planetary surveys, colony schematics, and technical specifications for Veltar life support systems. But Sarah, understand this, if you fail, it's not just 50,000 lives lost. It's humanity's reputation in galactic affairs. We'll go from being tolerated oddities to being seen as unreliable when it matters most. Sarah nodded grimly. And if we succeed? Then maybe the galaxy starts seeing us as more than useful monsters. Maybe they start seeing us as allies worth having. The connection ended, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of responsibility. She activated the ship-wide communication system and heard her voice echo through every corridor and compartment of the Indomitable. All hands, this is the captain. In 6 hours we will depart for the Kepler 442 system to attempt the rescue of 50,000 Veltar civilians from a hostile alien force. The environmental conditions will be extreme even by our standards. The enemy is unknown and possibly strengthened by the very conditions we'll be fighting in. The timeline is tight, and there's no backup coming if we fail. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. I won't order anyone to participate in this mission. What we're about to attempt goes beyond normal duty requirements. Anyone who wishes to transfer off before departure may do so without prejudice or mark on their record. This is volunteer only. Sarah waited, watching the ship's roster on her personal display. Not a single name disappeared from the active duty list. If anything, she could hear boots on deck plates as crew members hurried to their stations preparing for immediate departure. Captain, Marcus Webb's voice carried the hint of a smile. With respect, did you really think any of us would back down from a chance to show the galaxy what deathworlders can do? Around the bridge, heads nodded in agreement. Chief Martinez called up from engineering. Captain, we can push the engines harder than the Council specs suggest. Their definition of maximum safe speed is apparently different from ours. We can cut 4 hours off the transit time. Do it, Sarah replied without hesitation. Communications, send a message to the Galactic Council. Tell them the deathworlders are coming. As the Indomitable prepared to break orbit, Sarah reflected on the strange turn their species had taken. For decades, humanity had been content to remain on the periphery of galactic civilization, trading occasionally but avoiding entanglement in council politics. They had been seen as dangerous primitives from a hostile world, tolerated because they occasionally proved useful in extreme situations. Now, for the first time, the galaxy was asking them not just to endure impossible conditions, but to succeed where every other species had already admitted failure. They weren't being called in as expendable shock troops or suicidal volunteers. They were being asked to save lives that no one else could save, in conditions no one else could survive. The ship shuddered as the engines pushed beyond their rated capacity, racing toward a world that would test every aspect of human endurance and ingenuity. Behind them, Earth grew smaller in the view screen, but its lessons remained. Survive, adapt, overcome, and never leave anyone behind. The deathworlders were going to war. The UES Indomitable dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system with barely controlled violence. The ship's hull groaned under the stress as emergency systems fought to compensate for the aggressive deceleration. On the bridge, Captain Sarah Chen gripped her command chair as the main screen resolved into a view of their destination. Kepler 442b hung before them like a vision from humanity's worst nightmares. The planet's surface writhed with constant storm systems, lightning dancing between clouds of methane and sulfur. Even from orbit, the sensor readings made Sarah's crew exchange nervous glances. Surface pressure readings fluctuated wildly as massive weather fronts collided, creating zones where the atmosphere itself became a crushing weight. "Jesus Christ," whispered Lieutenant Park from the communications station. "The Veltar actually built a colony on that." Chief Engineer Martinez pulled up the geological surveys on her screen. Underground complex 3 kilometers down. They used the planet's natural cave systems and reinforced them with their best materials. Smart approach, actually. The deeper you go, the more stable the conditions become. "What's our current threat assessment?" Sarah asked. Tactical Officer Webb worked furiously at his station, correlating the incoming sensor data with the fragmentary reports from the Veltar distress calls. "Captain, I'm reading massive energy signatures across the entire surface. Whatever these shadow swarms are, they're not showing up on conventional sensors, but they're definitely affecting the planet's electromagnetic field." "How so?" "The entire planet is humming like a tuning fork. Every metal structure on the surface is vibrating in harmony. The mining equipment, the surface installations, even the orbital platforms are resonating at the same frequency." Sarah felt her blood run cold. "Could that resonance affect our equipment?" "Unknown, Captain. Our gear is built to different specifications than Veltar technology. But if these entities can manipulate electromagnetic fields on a planetary scale..." He didn't need to finish. Sarah understood the implication. Their environmental suits, weapons, and communication equipment all relied on electronic systems. If the enemy could disrupt those systems, they would be fighting naked on a world that wanted to kill them. "Communications, any word from the colony?" Lieutenant Park shook his head. "Nothing coherent, Captain. I'm picking up fragments of automated distress beacons, but no direct communication from the survivors. Either their communication array is down or there are no survivors to send messages," Sarah finished grimly. "How long since the last confirmed transmission?" 18 hours, Captain." Sarah did quick mental calculations. The Veltar had estimated 72 hours of life support when the crisis began. If the last transmission was 18 hours ago, and they had already been under siege for unknown duration before that, time was running critically short. "Chief, what's the status on our environmental gear?" Martinez consulted her displays. "All suits tested and ready. We've modified them based on the planetary data, reinforced against the atmospheric corrosion and pressure variations. Power systems are triple redundant, and we've added thermal regulators for the temperature swings." "Weapons status?" Webb looked up from his station with grim satisfaction. "We've loaded out with everything we have that doesn't rely solely on electronics. Chemically powered projectile weapons, thermite charges, and some experimental plasma weapons that should work regardless of electromagnetic interference. If these shadow things bleed, we can make them hurt. What if they don't bleed? Then we get creative, Captain." "Human nature." Sarah nodded, appreciating her crew's dark humor in the face of impossible odds. It was quintessentially human, making jokes when staring death in the face. "Orbital insertion plan. That's where it gets interesting," Martinez replied, pulling up a 3-dimensional projection of the planet. "Normal landing protocols are out. The surface storms would tear apart any conventional dropship before it got within 10 kilometers of the ground. So how do we get down there?" "We don't land, Captain. We crash." The engineering display showed a descent trajectory that made Sarah's stomach lurch just looking at it. Instead of a controlled landing, Martinez was proposing a ballistic entry that would use the planet's crushing atmosphere as a brake, followed by emergency retro thrusters at the last possible moment. "Chief, that's not a landing. That's a controlled catastrophe." "Yes, ma'am. But it's a controlled catastrophe that gets us to the surface alive. The Veltar colony entrance is located in a relatively stable geological formation. If we time it right, we can crash land within 5 kilometers of the main access tunnel. And if we time it wrong, then we become the first humans to achieve terminal velocity on a 12-gravity world." Sarah looked around at her bridge crew. Each face showed the same mixture of fear and determination that she felt in her own chest. They were about to attempt something that every other species in the galaxy considered impossible: a military insertion onto a world that existed at the absolute limits of habitability, against an enemy that grew stronger in the conditions that would kill most life forms. How many personnel for the insertion team? Recommended team size is 20, Webb reported. Small enough to move quickly, large enough to handle significant resistance. Full environmental gear, heavy weapons, and enough supplies for 48 hours of independent operation. I'm going down with the team. Captain, with respect, that's not advisable. If something goes wrong, Marcus, then command decisions are going to need to be made on the ground, in real time, by someone with the authority to make them. Besides, she added with a slight smile, I didn't join the Deathworlder Corps to watch from orbit. Webb nodded, understanding. The human military had developed its own culture over the centuries, one that emphasized leading from the front and sharing the dangers with those under command. It was another aspect of human nature that other species found incomprehensible: the willingness of leaders to risk themselves for their subordinates. Departure in 6 hours, Sarah announced. I want every piece of equipment tested twice, every contingency planned for, and every team member mentally prepared for the worst conditions any of us have ever faced. As the crew dispersed to their final preparations, Sarah remained on the bridge, staring at the tortured world below. Somewhere beneath those storms, 50,000 Veltar civilians were fighting for their lives against an enemy that fed on the very conditions that made their world uninhabitable. The galaxy had called upon the deathworlders because no one else could survive what was coming. Now it was time to prove that human reputation was more than just scary stories. It was time to show the universe what humans did when others couldn't. They went anyway. The storm-racked planet turned slowly beneath them, waiting. The descent pod screamed through Kepler 442b's atmosphere like a falling star, its hull glowing cherry red from friction despite the heat shields. Inside, 20 human Marines were pressed against their restraint harnesses as 12 times Earth's gravity tried to crush them into paste. Captain Sarah Chen fought to stay conscious as the G-forces peaked, her vision tunneling to a narrow point of light. 30 seconds to emergency retrofire, Chief Martinez's voice crackled through the comm system, distorted by both atmospheric interference and the electromagnetic disturbance that surrounded the planet. Sarah keyed her mic with tremendous effort. All teams. Sound off. One by one her Marines reported in. Somehow, impossibly, they were all still conscious and responsive despite conditions that would have killed most galactic species outright. The human cardiovascular system, evolved over millions of years of persistence hunting on a high-gravity world, was proving its worth once again. 10 seconds to retrofire. Brace for impact. The emergency rockets fired with bone-jarring force, fighting against their terminal velocity. For a moment, Sarah thought they might actually pull off a controlled landing. Then the shadow swarms hit them. They rose from the planet's surface like living darkness, flowing against the wind and storm currents with impossible grace. Up close, they weren't quite shadows. They had substance, but it seemed to shift and writhe as if reality itself couldn't quite decide what they were. When they struck the descent pod, the hull rang like a bell, and every electronic system aboard began to flicker. Electronics are failing, Martinez shouted. Whatever these things are, they're creating massive electromagnetic interference. The retro rocket sputtered and died. The pod's automated landing systems went dark. In the space of 10 seconds, their controlled descent became a barely guided crash toward the surface of hell. Emergency positions, Sarah barked. Hard landing in 3, 2, 1. The pod hit the surface of Kepler 442b with the force of a small meteor. The impact drove the air from Sarah's lungs and sent shockwaves through her bones. Around her, she heard the groans and curses of her team as they struggled to recover from a landing that would have been instantly fatal to most galactic species. Sound off. Anyone seriously injured? The responses came back slowly but steadily. Bruises, possible concussions, and one dislocated shoulder, but nothing that would prevent them from completing the mission. Sarah felt a moment of fierce pride in her species. They had just survived a crash landing on a death world under hostile fire, and they were already preparing to fight. Environmental systems check, she ordered. The Marines ran through their suit diagnostics. The modifications Martinez had made were proving their worth. Despite the electromagnetic interference, the suit's basic life support was still functioning. The armor's composite plating had protected them from the worst of the atmospheric corrosion, and the internal temperature regulators were successfully compensating for the planet's extreme thermal variations. External sensors are mostly dead, reported Sergeant Kim, the team's electronics specialist. But basic suit functions are operational. Looks like the chief's analog backup systems were a good idea. Sarah nodded. They had anticipated electronic warfare, though not quite on this scale. The shadow swarms weren't just hostile alien creatures. They were a form of life that existed in harmony with electromagnetic fields, able to manipulate them as easily as humans manipulated their physical environment. Weapons check. The team's armament had been chosen specifically for this contingency. Chemical-powered projectile weapons that didn't rely on electronic firing systems, thermite charges for breaching operations, and experimental plasma weapons that generated their own electromagnetic fields, rather than depending on suit power. All weapons functional. Captain, reported Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the team's heavy weapons specialist, though I'm not sure how effective they'll be against enemies made of living energy. We'll find out soon enough. Martinez, what's our distance to the colony entrance? The chief engineer consulted her mechanical compass and hand-drawn maps, low-tech navigation that couldn't be disrupted by electromagnetic interference. 4.7 kilometers northeast. The terrain is rough, but we can make it in 2 hours if we push hard. Then we push hard. These people have been under siege for days. Every minute counts. The team formed up in standard patrol formation and began their march across the surface of Kepler 442b. Within minutes, Sarah understood why the Veltar had built their colony underground. The surface was a hellscape of jagged rock formations, sculpted by constant chemical erosion, creating a maze of knife-sharp ridges and hidden chasms. The atmospheric pressure varied wildly as massive storm fronts collided overhead, sometimes dropping to levels where their suits had to compensate for near vacuum, other times spiking to pressures that made each step feel like walking through thick mud. The temperature swings were even worse. Sarah watched her suit's external thermometer swing from minus 150 Celsius in the shadow of a rock formation to plus 280 in direct sunlight, sometimes within the space of a few steps. Without their modified environmental suits, they would have been dead within minutes, but they were deathworlders. They had evolved on a planet where survival meant adapting to impossible conditions, and they had spent centuries pushing those adaptations to their absolute limits. What would kill other species was just another challenging hike for human marines. "Contact," whispered Corporal Zhang from the point position. "Movement ahead. Multiple targets." Sarah crept forward to join the advance scout, keeping low among the razor-edged rocks. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The shadow swarms were feeding. Dozens of the creatures flowed across a section of exposed Veltar mining equipment, their forms rippling and shifting as they absorbed electromagnetic energy from the machinery. As they fed, the metal structures began to resonate, humming with the same harmonic frequency that Webb had detected from orbit. The sound was eerily beautiful and utterly alien, a song of energy beings communing with the harsh environment that sustained them. They're not destroying the equipment, Sarah realized. They're converting it, making it part of their environment. "Captain," Sergeant Kim's voice was tight with professional concern. "If they can do that to Veltar mining equipment, what happens when they encounter the colony's life support systems?" Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. The shadow swarms weren't just attacking the colony, they were assimilating it. Every piece of technology, every power conduit, every electronic system was being converted into part of their electromagnetic ecosystem. The Veltar weren't just under siege. They were being consumed by creatures that found their technology as nourishing as the planet's harsh conditions. "New priority," she announced to the team. "We're not just conducting a rescue operation. We're racing against time before these things turn the colony's own systems against the people we're trying to save." The team acknowledged with grim understanding. They resumed their advance across the hostile landscape, 20 humans against an alien force that grew stronger with every passing moment, on a world that existed at the very edge of what their species could survive. Behind them, their crashed descent pod began to hum with harmonic resonance. As the shadow swarms discovered this new source of electromagnetic energy, the deathworlders were truly on their own now. The entrance to the Veltar colony was a masterpiece of engineering, even by human standards. Carved directly into the living rock of Kepler 442b, The main access tunnel descended at a steep angle, reinforced with crystalline supports that could withstand the planet's crushing pressures and corrosive atmosphere. Under normal circumstances, it would have been impressive. Under current circumstances, it was terrifying. The tunnel hummed. Captain Sarah Chen held up her hand, stopping her team at the entrance. The harmonic resonance was stronger here, vibrating through their bones and making their teeth ache. Worse, she could see the crystalline supports beginning to change, their molecular structure shifting as the shadow swarm's influence spread through the colony's infrastructure. Sergeant Kim, can you detect any survivors? The electronics specialist consulted his few remaining functional sensors. Most of their equipment was dead or dying from electromagnetic interference, but Kim had managed to jury-rig a basic life sign detector using analog components. Picking up multiple heat signatures approximately 2 kilometers down, Captain. Concentrated in what appears to be the main habitation areas, but... He paused, frowning at his readings. The signals are weak and getting weaker. Life support failure. Possibly. Or something else is draining power from their systems. Sarah didn't need him to elaborate. The shadow swarms weren't just attacking the colony. They were feeding on it, converting its technology into extensions of their own electromagnetic ecosystem. Every minute they delayed meant more of the life support systems would be compromised. We go in fast and hard, she decided. Standard sweep and clear, but watch for environmental hazards. The tunnel structure might not be stable. The team descended into the colony with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated by years of training in hostile environments. The artificial lighting flickered and failed as they progressed, forcing them to rely on chemical light sources that couldn't be disrupted by electromagnetic interference. The resulting illumination cast eerie shadows on walls that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "Captain," whispered Corporal Zhang from the point position, "you need to see this." Sarah moved forward to join him at an observation window overlooking one of the colony's main chambers. What she saw defied easy description. The shadow swarms had infiltrated the colony's power distribution network, flowing through conduits and cables like liquid electricity. Where they passed, the Veltar technology was being transformed. Metal structures becoming organic-looking growths that pulsed with bioluminescent energy. But it wasn't random destruction. There was pattern and purpose to the transformation. The shadow swarms were creating something, a hybrid environment that combined the colony's technological infrastructure with their own electromagnetic nature. They're not trying to destroy the colony, Sarah realized with growing horror. They're trying to make it habitable for themselves. "Captain," Sergeant Rodriguez's voice crackled over the comm, "if they succeed in converting the life support systems, the Veltar die and the shadow swarms gain a permanent foothold in galactic space." Sarah finished. They could use the colony as a staging ground to spread to other worlds. The implications were staggering. The shadow swarms weren't just a threat to one mining colony. They represented a completely alien form of life that could potentially consume and convert all technological civilization in the galaxy. They were the ultimate invasive species, capable of turning their victims' own tools against them. "New mission parameters," Sarah announced to her team. "Rescue the survivors, but also ensure that whatever these things are building down here doesn't survive to spread." The Marines acknowledged with grim understanding. They resumed their descent, moving deeper into a colony that was rapidly becoming something else entirely. They found the first survivors 3 levels down, huddled in an emergency shelter, whose basic life support was failing. The Veltar were a reptilian species, roughly humanoid but adapted for high-pressure environments. Under normal circumstances, they were hardy and resilient. Now they looked fragile and desperate, their scaled skin pale with exhaustion and fear. "Human rescue team," Sarah announced as her Marines secured the area. "We're here to get you out." The Veltar colony leader, identifiable by the elaborate crests on his skull, stared at the humans with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Impossible. No species can survive on the surface. The atmospheric conditions alone..." "We're not most species," Sarah replied simply. "How many survivors?" 43,812, the leader replied with typical Veltar precision. "Scattered throughout 14 emergency shelters across the colony. But the power systems are failing. The shadow creatures, they're turning our own technology against us. How long do you have? Perhaps 6 hours at current rate of system degradation. Less if they penetrate the primary life support nexus. Sarah did rapid mental calculations. 43,000 people, 14 locations, 6 hours maximum, and only 20 Marines. Under normal circumstances, it would be impossible. But these weren't normal circumstances, and they weren't normal Marines. "We need a new approach," Sarah announced to her team as they huddled in the emergency shelter with the Veltar survivors. "Traditional extraction methods won't work with 43,000 people in a 6-hour window." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez looked up from his tactical display. "Captain, even if we had transport capacity, the surface conditions would kill the Veltar before we could get them to orbit. Their environmental suits aren't designed for extended exposure to the surface storms." "Then we don't take them to the surface," Sarah replied, her mind racing through possibilities. "Chief Martinez, what's the structural integrity of the main colony levels?" The engineer consulted her hand-drawn schematics, comparing them with what they had observed during their descent. "The lower levels are more stable, less electromagnetic interference from the surface phenomena. If we could seal off the affected areas and restore power to the primary systems, the shadow swarms would just break through again," interrupted Sergeant. "They're not bound by physical barriers. They flow through the power conduits like they're highways." Sarah stared at the colony schematics, searching for inspiration. The Veltar leader watched her with growing desperation, clearly understanding that traditional rescue methods were inadequate for their situation. "Captain," Corporal Zhang spoke up quietly, "what if we're thinking about this wrong? We're trying to fight the shadow swarms, but what if we worked with them instead?" Explain. "They feed on electromagnetic energy and hostile environmental conditions. This planet provides both in abundance. They're not trying to destroy the colony. They're trying to make it more like their natural habitat." Sarah began to understand. "You're suggesting we give them what they want." "Not exactly. I'm suggesting we redirect what they want. Look at the power distribution network. They're following the paths of least resistance, just like any energy phenomenon. What if we created a more attractive path?" Martinez caught on immediately. "A electromagnetic honeypot. We route all the colony's power through a single, heavily shielded conduit that leads away from the life support systems." "It might work," Kim added, pulling up his sensor readings. "The shadow swarms seem to be attracted to high-energy density areas. If we could create an artificial concentration of electromagnetic activity, we'd be sacrificing part of the colony to save the rest," Sarah realized. "The question is, can we do it without losing the people?" The Veltar leader stepped forward, his crest flattened in a gesture of desperate determination. "Human Captain, if your plan can save even half our people, we will attempt it. We have lost too many already to hesitate at theoretical risks." Sarah nodded grimly. The plan was dangerous and unprecedented, but it was better than watching 43,000 people die while they waited for a perfect solution that might never come. "Here's how we do this," she announced. "We split into 3 teams. Team Alpha secures the primary life support nexus and begins evacuating survivors to the deepest, most stable levels. Team Beta sets up our electromagnetic honeypot in the mining equipment bay. Lots of heavy machinery there to mask our activities. Team Charlie provides overwatch and handles any direct confrontations with the shadow swarms." "What about power for the evacuation areas?" asked Martinez. "We cannibalize the mining equipment. Strip out every portable power cell and emergency battery in the colony. Basic life support only, no luxuries, no non-essential systems. We're buying time, not comfort." The teams dispersed with practiced efficiency, each group taking several Veltar guides who knew the colony's layout better than any schematic. Sarah accompanied Team Beta to the mining bay, where they began the delicate process of creating an irresistible target for the shadow swarms. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Using the colony's own power generation systems, they created a massive electromagnetic concentration in an area that could be safely isolated from the rest of the facility. The shadow swarms, attracted by the energy density, would flow toward the honeypot and become trapped in a sealed section of the colony. In theory. "Initiating power rerouting now," Martinez announced as her fingers flew over manual control switches. The electronic systems were still unreliable, forcing them to rely on purely mechanical interfaces that couldn't be disrupted by electromagnetic interference. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Throughout the colony, lights flickered and power fluctuated as massive amounts of energy were redirected toward the mining bay. The harmonic humming that had pervaded the facility changed pitch, becoming deeper and more resonant. "Contact," Rodriguez's voice crackled over the comm from his overwatch position. Multiple shadow swarms converging on the mining bay. They're moving faster than before. Sarah watched through a reinforced observation window as the creatures flowed through the corridors like living darkness, drawn inexorably toward the electromagnetic concentration they had created. Up close, she could see that they weren't truly incorporeal. They had structure and form, but it existed primarily in electromagnetic spectrums that human eyes couldn't normally perceive. "They're beautiful," whispered one of the Veltar technicians working alongside Martinez. "I've never seen anything like them," Sarah had to agree. Despite the danger they represented, the shadow swarms moved with an alien grace that was oddly hypnotic. They flowed around obstacles like water, but when they encountered electromagnetic fields, they danced and spiraled with obvious joy. They weren't malevolent invaders. They were simply a form of life so fundamentally different from biological entities that coexistence seemed impossible. "Honeypot is at maximum capacity," Martinez reported. "I'm reading massive electromagnetic concentrations in the mining bay. If this works, we should be able to seal them in and restore normal power to the rest of the colony." "Do it." Martinez activated the containment protocols. Heavy blast doors slammed shut around the mining bay, physically isolating it from the rest of the colony. Simultaneously, emergency power systems came online throughout the facility, restoring life support to areas that had been dark for hours. For a moment, it seemed like the plan had worked perfectly. The colony's system stabilized, the harmonic humming faded to background levels, and the electromagnetic interference that had been disrupting their equipment began to clear. Then the blast doors began to glow. "Captain," Kim's voice was tight with professional alarm, "the shadow swarms aren't contained. They're converting the blast doors themselves, turning them into conductors." Sarah watched in fascination and horror as the heavy metal barriers began to resonate with the same harmonic frequency as the shadow swarms. The creatures hadn't been trapped. They had found a new tool to use in their transformation of the colony. How long before they break through? At current conversion rate? Maybe 30 minutes. Sarah felt the weight of command settle on her shoulders. They had bought time and confirmed that the survivors could be kept alive in the deeper levels, but they hadn't solved the fundamental problem. The shadow swarms were still there, still feeding, still converting everything they touched. "All teams, new orders," she announced over the comm. "Continue the evacuation to the deepest levels. We're going to have to try something else." As her Marines herded the last group of Veltar survivors toward the emergency shelters, Sarah stared at the glowing blast doors and tried to think like a deathworlder. What would humans do when faced with an impossible situation? They would get creative. Sarah Chen stood in the deepest chamber of the Veltar colony, surrounded by 43,000 frightened aliens and 20 exhausted human Marines. Above them, the shadow swarms had broken through the containment barriers and were spreading throughout the facility once again. Their electromagnetic honeypot had bought precious time, but now the creatures were adapting, becoming more aggressive in their conversion of the colony's systems. "Captain," Martinez reported grimly, "life support in the upper levels is failing completely. The shadow swarms have learned to actively target critical systems rather than just feeding on whatever they encounter." "How long do we have down here?" 6 hours, maybe 8 if we shut down all non-essential systems and put people into emergency hibernation pods." Sarah looked around at the Veltar survivors. They were a hardy species, but they weren't deathworlders. Extended hibernation and failing life support systems would kill many of them before rescue could arrive. The math was brutal and unforgiving. "There has to be another way," she muttered, staring at the colony schematics one more time. "Captain," the Veltar colony leader approached her with obvious reluctance. "My people have been discussing our situation. We have a proposal." Sarah turned to face him, noting the way his crest was flattened in what she had learned was a gesture of extreme submission among his species. "We know about human reputation. You call yourselves deathworlders because you can survive conditions that kill other species. But there is something else about humans that the galaxy whispers about in fear, which is, when faced with impossible choices, humans do impossible things. They sacrifice themselves for strangers. They fight wars they cannot win to protect people they have never met. He paused, searching for words. "They choose death before dishonor." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you asking?" "The shadow swarms need electromagnetic energy and harsh environmental conditions to thrive. This planet provides both. But humans survive on death worlds. What if you took us somewhere the shadow swarms cannot follow? The surface is uninhabitable for your species. Even our environmental suits couldn't protect you for more than a few minutes. Not the surface, the Veltar leader said quietly. Space. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah understood what he was proposing, a desperate gambit that would require every person in the colony to trust their lives to human ingenuity and courage. You want us to evacuate 43,000 people to orbit in makeshift life support pods through atmospheric conditions that would destroy most spacecraft, using equipment that's failing due to electromagnetic interference. Yes. Sarah looked around at her Marines. Each face showed the same mixture of determination and fear that she felt in her own chest. What the Veltar leader was proposing wasn't a rescue mission. It was a suicide run with a slim chance of success. Martinez, is it even theoretically possible? The chief engineer was already running calculations on her analog computer. We'd need to cannibalize every piece of functional technology in the colony to create enough emergency pods. Basic life support only. No navigation systems, no communication equipment. We'd be launching them blind and hoping they achieve stable orbit. What about launch capability? The colony has an emergency evacuation system, magnetic rail launcher designed to get people to orbit if the main transport was disabled. But it's never been tested with this many pods, and the electromagnetic interference from the shadow swarms would make targeting impossible, so we'd be firing 43,000 people into space and hoping they don't burn up in the atmosphere or drift off into deep space. That's about the size of it. Captain, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to think like a human, a death worlder facing impossible odds with no good options. Around her, she could hear the colony's structure groaning as the shadow swarms continued their relentless conversion of every system they could reach. What would our survival probability be? She asked. Martinez consulted her calculations again.
For the Veltar?
Maybe 30% if everything goes perfectly. For us, we'd have to stay behind to operate the launch system and fight off the shadow swarms. Maybe 10%. And if we do nothing, 0% for everyone. Sarah opened her eyes and looked around at her team. 20 of the finest Marines humanity had ever produced, trained for impossible missions in hostile environments. They had volunteered for this mission, knowing it might be a one-way trip. Now they were faced with a choice that would define not just their own fate, but humanity's reputation in galactic affairs. I need honest opinions, she announced. This is beyond anything we've attempted. We'd be risking 43,000 lives on a plan that's barely more than controlled catastrophe. Captain, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez spoke up. With respect, that describes most of human history. Our species didn't conquer Earth by playing it safe. One by one, her Marines nodded agreement. They were deathworlders by birth and choice, descendants of a species that had survived ice ages, plagues, natural disasters, and countless wars by refusing to give up when the odds were impossible. All right, Sarah decided. We do this, but we do it right. Martinez, I want every emergency pod tested and retested. Rodriguez, organize security teams to hold off the shadow swarms while we work. Kim, jury-rig communication equipment so we can coordinate the launch sequence. What about us, Captain? The Veltar leader asked. You help however you can, and you trust us to get your people home safely. The next 4 hours were a blur of frantic activity. Human Marines worked alongside Veltar technicians to strip every functional component from the dying colony and reassemble them into basic life support pods. The shadow swarms pressed closer, converting more systems every minute. But they seemed to avoid the areas where humans were working, perhaps sensing that these strange creatures from a death world represented a threat they didn't understand. Last pod is ready, Martinez reported as the final group of Veltar civilians was sealed into their makeshift escape vehicle. Launch sequence can begin whenever you give the word. Sarah looked around at the launching chamber. 43,000 emergency pods were loaded into the magnetic rail system, ready to be fired into orbit in a precisely timed sequence that would hopefully give each pod the best chance of reaching safety. Her 20 Marines stood at their positions, hands on manual controls that couldn't be disrupted by electromagnetic interference. They would fire each pod individually, adjusting for atmospheric conditions and orbital mechanics in real time, using nothing but human intuition and mathematical skill. All teams ready? The responses came back clearly. Her people were ready to attempt the impossible because someone needed them to try. Initiate launch sequence. Send them home. The magnetic rail launcher fired with tremendous force, sending the first wave of pods screaming toward orbit. Through the observation windows, Sarah could see them disappearing into the storm-racked atmosphere, carried by human engineering and desperate hope. One by one, 43,000 pods were fired into space. Some would make it to stable orbit where they could be recovered by Galactic Council ships. Others would be lost to the hostile environment of Kepler 442b. But every single one had a chance that wouldn't exist if the deathworlders hadn't answered the call. As the last pod disappeared into the storm, Sarah turned to her team. The shadow swarms were converging on their position, no longer held back by the electromagnetic systems they had been converting. "Well," she said with a slight smile, "I suppose now we find out if these things can be killed after all." 20 human Marines raised their weapons and prepared to face an alien enemy that fed on the very conditions that made their homeworld uninhabitable. They were deathworlders, and they had just sent 43,000 people toward safety. Now it was time to earn their reputation. Above them, in the cold vacuum of space, emergency pods began achieving stable orbit. The Galactic Council's rescue ships moved in to collect the survivors, guided by transponder signals from equipment that had been built by human hands in the depths of an impossible world. The cry for aid had been answered. The deathworlders had kept their promise.